yes, okay. Back with Edgar Allan Poe. Hope you're having a great whatever it is for you. We'll get right into it because I am short on time. So, oh, where is it? Come back. Da-da-da. Why aren't you working? Oh no! So I'm having slight issues. Hang on with my uh oh, hang on. I got this. Nope, that's not it. There you are. No. 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 There you are. Okay. Let's just make sure it works. Excellent. Yes, we are back with more short stories by Edgar Allan Poe. I just have to get the icon off, and then we're gonna ba-ba-da-boom. We're starting with The Man of the Crowd. Ba-da-boom. There. And we're back in business. The Man of the Crowd, and I do have... Oh, I'm testing. Testing audio. Yes, excellent. Boom. Out, and I do have some abouts now. The Man of the Crowd, a nameless narrator follows a man through a crowded London, first published in 1840. And it's about, shoot, what was it? I looked it up before, the last time, because I thought I was going to get to it. And so basically there's paranoia, and the sense of, and I want to think, hang on. Oh no. Also wanted to do this quick. Nope, not that one. Nope, not that one. Perfect. Okay. So this one, The Man of the Crowd, is about, I can't remember what it's called. So the man in the crowd is a sort of phenomenon thing. So I guess we're going to see. It's about paranoia, and that's a good time. So The Man of the Crowd by Edgar Allan Poe. Ce grand malheur. So that bad something. De ne pouvoir être seul. This great misfortune of not being able to be alone. I feel that. Although probably not a lot of people do at the moment. They prefer the people. La bruyère. I didn't get that right, but I'm working on it. It was well said of a certain German book that I will not try to do that accent because I haven't been studying it. He doesn't let sick read. Er lässt sick nicht lesen. It is well said of a certain German book that he doesn't let the sick read. It does not permit itself to be read. There are some secrets which do not permit themselves to be told. Fair. Sorry about that. This is just a disaster from the outset. I do want to highlight this because I really like it. Men die nightly in their beds, wringing the hands of ghostly confessors and looking them piteously in the eyes, die with despair of heart and convulsion of throat on account of the hideousness of mysteries which will not suffer themselves to be revealed. I feel that too. Now and then, alas, the conscience of man takes up a burthen so heavy in horror that it can be thrown down only into the grave. And thus the essence of all crime is undivulged. Not long ago, about the closing in of an evening in autumn, I sat at the large bow window. I didn't want the cursor on. Whatever, I'll put it there. Excellent. Not long ago, about the closing in of an evening in autumn, I sat at the large bow window of the D Coffee House in London. For some months I had been ill in health, but was now convalescent, and, with returning strength, found myself in one of those happy moods which are so precisely the converse of ennui, moods of the keenest appetency, when the film from the mental vision departs, the "neh" and the intellect electrified, surpasses as greatly its everyday condition as does the vivid yet candid reason of Leibniz, the mad and flimsy rhetoric of Gorgias. I'll see if this allows itself to be revealed, this secret. Not even a little bit. That's even worse. So we'll continue. Merely to breathe was enjoyment, and I derived positive pleasure even from many of the legitimate sources of pain. I felt a calm but inquisitive interest in everything. With a cigar in my mouth and a newspaper in my lap, I had been amusing myself for the greater part of the afternoon. Now in... Sorry, I want to get the cursor off. There we go. Now... I had been amusing myself for the greater part of the afternoon, now in poring over advertisements, now in observing the promiscuous company in the room, and now in peering through the smoky panes into the street. This latter is one of the principal thoroughfares of the city, and had been very much crowded during the whole day. But as the darkness came on, the throng momently increased, and by the time the lamps were well lighted, two dense and continuous tides of population were rushing past the door. At this particular period of the evening, I had never before been in a similar situation, and the tumultuous sea of human heads filled me, therefore, with a delicious novelty of emotion. I gave up at length all care of things within the hotel, and became absorbed in contemplation of the scene without. At first, my observations took an abstract and generalizing turn. I looked at the passengers in masses, and thought of them in their aggregate relations. Soon, however, I descended to details, and regarded with minute interest the innumerable varieties of figure, dress, air, gait, visage, and expression of countenance. By far the greater number of those who went by had a satisfied, business-like demeanor, and seemed to be thinking only of making their way through the press. Their brows were knit, and their eyes rolled quickly. When pushed against by fellow wayfarers, they evinced no symptom of impatience, but adjusted their clothes and hurried on. Others, still a numerous class, were restless in their movements, had flushed faces, and talked and gesticulated to themselves as if feeling in solitude on account of the very denseness of the company around. When impeded in their progress, these people suddenly ceased muttering, but redoubled their gesticulations, and awaited, with an absent and overdone smile upon the lips, the course of the persons impeding them. If jostled, they bowed profusely to the jostlers, and appeared overwhelmed with confusion. There was nothing very distinctive about these two large classes beyond what I have noted. Their habiliments belonged to that order which is pointedly termed the decent. They were undoubtedly noblemen, merchants, attorneys, tradesmen, stock jobbers, the eupatrids and the commonplaces of society, men of leisure and men actively engaged in affairs of their own, conducting business upon their own responsibility. They did not greatly excite my attention. The tribe of clerks was an obvious one, and here I discerned two remarkable divisions. There were the junior clerks of flash houses, young gentlemen with tight coats, bright boots, well-oiled hair, and supercilious lips. Setting aside a certain dapperness of carriage, which may be termed deskism, for want of a better word, the manner of these persons seemed to me an exact facsimile of what had been the perfect bon ton about 12 or 18 months before. They wore the cast-off graces of the gentry, and this, I believe, involves the best definition of the class. The division of the upper clerks of staunch firms, or of the steady old fellows, it was not possible to mistake. These were known by their coats and pantaloons of black or brown, made to sit comfortably, with white cravats and waistcoats, broad, solid-looking shoes, and thick hose or gaiters. They had all slightly bald heads, from which the right ears, long used to pen-holding, had an odd habit of standing off on end. I observed that they always removed or settled their hats with both hands, and wore watches with short gold chains of a substantial and ancient pattern. Theirs was the affectation of respectability, if indeed there be an affectation so honorable. There were many individuals of dashing appearance, whom I easily understood as belonging to the race of swell pickpockets with which all great cities are infested. I watched these gentry with much inquisitiveness, and found it difficult to imagine how they should ever be mistaken for gentlemen by gentlemen themselves. Their voluminousness of wristband, with an air of excessive frankness, should betray them at once. The gamblers, of whom I descried not a few, were still more easily recognizable. They wore every variety of dress, from that of the desperate thimble-rig bully, with velvet waistcoat, fancy neckerchief, gilt chains, and filigreed buttons, to that of the scrupulously inornate clergyman, than which nothing could be less liable to suspicion. Still, all were distinguished by a certain sodden swarthiness of complexion, a filmy dimness of eye, and pallor and compression of lip. There were two other traits, moreover, by which I could always detect them. a guarded lowness of tone in conversation, and a more than ordinary extension of the thumb in a direction at right angles with the fingers. Very often, in company with these sharpers, I observed an order of men somewhat different in habits, but still birds of a kindred feather. They may be defined as the gentlemen who live by their wits. They seem to prey upon the public in two battalions, that of the dandies and that of the military men. Of the first grade, the leading features are long locks and smiles. Of the second, frogged coats and frowns. Descending in the scale of what is termed gentility, I found darker and deeper themes for speculation. I saw Jew peddlers, with hawk eyes flashing from countenances, whose every other feature wore only an expression of abject humility, sturdy professional street beggars scowling upon mendicants of a better stamp, whom despair alone had driven forth into the night for charity, feeble and ghastly invalids upon whom death had placed a sure hand, and who sidled and tottered through the mob, looking everyone beseechingly in the face, as if in search. Sorry, I had a window pop up. Feeble and ghastly invalids upon whom death had placed a sure hand, and who sidled and tottered through the mob, looking every one beseechingly in the face, as if in search of some chance consolation, some lost hope. Modest young girls returning from long and late labor to a cheerless home, and shrinking more tearfully than indignantly from the glances of ruffians, whose direct contact even could not be avoided. Women of the town of all kinds and of all ages, the unequivocal beauty in the prime of her womanhood, putting one in mind of the statue in Lucian, with the surface of Parian marble and the interior filled with filth, the loathsome and utterly lost leper in rags, the wrinkled, bejeweled, and paint-begrimed beldame. Beldame or beldam? Beldam, an old woman. The wrinkled, bejeweled, and paint-begrimed beldam, making a last effort at youth, the mere child of immature form, yet, from long association, an adept in the dreadful coquetries of her trade, and burning with a rabid ambition to be ranked the equal of her elders in vice. Drunkards innumerable and indescribable, some in shreds and patches, reeling, inarticulate, with bruised visage and lackluster eyes, some in whole, although filthy garments, with a slightly unsteady swagger, thick, sensual lips, and hearty-looking, rubicund faces. Others clothed in materials which had once been good, and which even now were scrupulously well brushed. Men who walked with a more than naturally firm and springy step, but whose countenances were fearfully pale, whose eyes hideously wild and red, and who clutched with quivering fingers as they strode through the crowd at every object which came within their reach. Beside these, piemen, porters, coal heavers, sweeps, organ grinders, monkey exhibitors, and ballad mongers, those who vended with those who sang, ragged artisans and exhausted laborers of every description, and all full of a noisy and inordinate vivacity which jarred discordantly upon the ear and gave an aching sensation to the eye. As the night deepened, so deepened to me the interest of the scene, for not only did the general character of the crowd materially alter, its gentler features retiring in the gradual withdrawal of the more orderly portion of the people, and its harsher ones coming out into bolder relief, as the late hour brought forth every species of infamy from its den. But the rays of the gas lamps, feeble at first in their struggle with the dying day, had now at length gained ascendancy, and threw over everything a fitful and garish luster. All was dark, yet splendid, as that ebony to which has been likened the style of Tertullian. The wild effects of the light enchained me to an examination of individual faces, and although the rapidity with which the world of light flitted before the window prevented me from casting more than a glance upon each visage, still it seemed that, in my then peculiar mental state, I could frequently read, even in that brief interval of a glance, the history of long years. With my brow to the glass, I was thus occupied in scrutinizing the mob, when suddenly there came into view a countenance, that of a decrepit old man, some 65 or 70 years of age, a countenance which at once arrested and absorbed my whole attention, on account of the absolute idiosyncrasy of its expression. Anything even remotely resembling that expression I had never seen before. I well remember that my first thought, upon beholding it, was that wretch, had he viewed it, would have greatly preferred it to his own pictorial incarnations of the fiend. As I endeavored, during the brief minute of my original survey, to form some analysis of the meaning conveyed, there arose confusedly and paradoxically within my mind the ideas of vast mental power, of caution, of penuriousness, of avarice, of coolness, of malice, of bloodthirstiness, of triumph, of merriment, of excessive terror, of intense, of supreme despair. I felt singularly aroused, startled, fascinated. How wild a history, I said to myself, is written within that bosom. Then came a craving desire to keep the man in view, to know more of him. Hurriedly putting on an overcoat and seizing my hat and cane, I made my way into the street and pushed through the crowd in the direction which I had seen him take, for he had already disappeared. With some little difficulty, I at length came within sight of him, approached and followed him closely, yet cautiously, so as not to attract his attention. I had now a good opportunity of examining his person. He was short in stature, very thin, and apparently very feeble. His clothes generally were filthy and ragged, but as he came now and then within the strong glare of a lamp, I perceived that his linen, although dirty, was of beautiful texture, and my vision deceived me, or, through a rent in a closely buttoned and evidently second-handed roquelaire. Roquelaire. Is there any definition? It's something to do with his clothing. Probably a coat. A closely buttoned and evidently second-handed roquelaire, which enveloped him, I caught a glimpse both of a diamond and of a dagger. These observations heightened my curiosity, and I resolved to follow the stranger whithersoever he should go. It was now fully nightfall, and a thick, humid fog hung over the city, soon ending in a settled and heavy rain. This change of weather had an odd effect upon the crowd, the whole of which was at once put into new commotion, and overshadowed by a world of umbrellas. The waver, the jostle, and the hum increased in a tenfold degree. For my own part, I did not much regard the rain, the lurking of an old fever in my system rendering the moisture somewhat too dangerously pleasant. Tying a handkerchief about my mouth, I kept on. For half an hour the old man held his way with difficulty along the great thoroughfare, and I here walked close at his elbow through fear of losing sight of him. Never once turning his head to look back, he did not observe me. By and by he passed into a cross street, which, although densely filled with people, was not quite so much thronged as the main one he had quitted. I'm curious as to by and by, spelled differently. Here a change in his demeanor became evident. He walked more slowly and with less object than before, more hesitatingly. He crossed and recrossed the way repeatedly without apparent aim, and the press was still so thick that, at every such movement, I was obliged to follow him closely. The street was a narrow and long one, and his course lay within it for nearly an hour, during which the passengers had gradually diminished to about that number which is ordinarily seen at noon in Broadway near the Park. So vast a difference is there between a London populace and that of the most frequented American city. A second turn brought us into a square brilliantly lighted and overflowing with life. The old manner of the stranger reappeared. His chin fell upon his breast, while his eyes rolled wildly from under his knit brows, in every direction upon those who hemmed him in. He urged his way steadily and perseveringly. I was surprised, however, to find upon his having made the circuit of the square, that he turned and retraced his steps. Still more was I astonished to see him repeat the same walk several times, once nearly detecting me as he came round with a sudden movement. In this exercise he spent another hour, at the end of which we met with far less interruption from passengers than at first. The rain fell fast, the air grew cool, and the people were retiring to their homes. With a gesture of impatience, the wanderer passed into a by-street comparatively deserted. Down this, some quarter of a mile long, he rushed with an activity I could not have dreamed of seeing in one so aged, and which put me to much trouble in pursuit. A few minutes brought us to a large and busy bazaar, with the localities of which the stranger appeared well acquainted, and where his original demeanor again became apparent, as he forced his way to and fro, without aim, among the host of buyers and sellers. During the hour and a half, or thereabouts, which we passed in this place, it required much caution on my part to keep him within reach without attracting his observation. Luckily, I wore a pair of caoutchouc. I feel like I have seen this natural rubber that has not been vulcanized. Caoutchouc. Yep. Caoutchouc. Luckily, I wore a pair of caoutchouc overshoes and could move about in perfect silence. At no moment did he see that I watched him. He entered shop after shop, priced nothing, spoke no word, and looked at all objects with a wild and vacant stare. I was now utterly amazed at his behavior, and firmly resolved that we should not part until I had satisfied myself in some measure respecting him. A loud-toned clock struck 11, and the company were fast deserting the bazaar. A shopkeeper, in putting up a shutter, jostled the old man, and at the instant I saw a strong shudder come over his frame. He hurried into the street, looked anxiously around him for an instant, and then ran with incredible swiftness through many crooked and peopleless lanes, until we emerged once more upon the great thoroughfare whence we had started, the street of the D Hotel. It no longer wore, however, the same aspect. It was still brilliant with gas, but the rain fell fiercely, and there were few persons to be seen. The stranger grew pale. He walked moodily some paces up the once populous avenue, then, with a heavy sigh, turned in the direction of the river, and plunging through a great variety of devious ways, came out at length in view of one of the principal theaters. It was about being closed, and the audience were thronging from the doors. I saw the old man gasp as if for breath while he threw himself amid the crowd, but I thought that the intense agony of his countenance had, in some measure, abated. His head again fell upon his breast. He appeared as I had seen him at first. I observed that he now took the course in which had gone the greater number of the audience, but upon the whole, I was at a loss to comprehend the waywardness of his actions. As he proceeded, the company grew more scattered, and his old uneasiness and vacillation were resumed. For some time he followed closely a party of some 10 or 12 roisterers, but from this number one by one dropped off, until 3 only remained together, in a narrow and gloomy lane little frequented. The stranger paused, and for a moment seemed lost in thought. Then, with every mark of agitation, pursued rapidly a route which brought us to the verge of the city, amid regions very different from those we had hitherto traversed. It was the most noisome quarter of London, where everything wore the worst impress of the most deplorable poverty, and of the most desperate crime. By the dim light of an accidental lamp, tall, antique, worm-eaten, wooden tenements were seen tottering to their fall, in directions so many and capricious that scarce the semblance of a passage was discernible between them. The paving stones lay at random, displaced from their beds by the rankly growing grass. Horrible filth festered in the dammed-up gutters. The whole atmosphere teemed with desolation. Yet, as we proceeded, the sounds of human life revived by sure degrees, and at length large bands of the most abandoned of a London populace were seen reeling to and fro. The spirits of the old man again flickered up, as a lamp which is near its death hour. Once more he strode onward with elastic tread. Suddenly, a corner was turned, a blaze of light burst upon our sight, and we stood before one of the huge suburban temples of intemperance, one of the palaces of the fiend, Gin. It was now nearly daybreak, but a number of wretched inebriates still pressed in and out of the flaunting entrance. With a half-shriek of joy, the old man forced a passage within, resumed at once his original bearing, and stalked backward and forward, without apparent object, among the throng. He had not been thus long occupied, however, before a rush to the doors gave token that the host was closing them for the night. It was something even more intense than despair that I then observed upon the countenance of the singular being whom I had watched so pertinaciously. Yet he did not hesitate in his career, but, with a mad energy, retraced his steps at once to the heart of the mighty London. Long and swiftly he fled, while I followed him in the wildest amazement, resolute not to abandon a scrutiny in which I now felt an interest all-absorbing. The sun arose while we proceeded, and when we had once again reached that most thronged part of the populous town, the street of the D Hotel, it presented an appearance of human bustle and activity scarcely inferior to what I had seen on the evening before. And here, long, amid the momently increasing confusion, did I persist in my pursuit of the stranger. But, as usual, he walked to and fro, and during the day did not pass from out the turmoil of that street. And as the shades of the second evening came on, I grew wearied unto death, and stopping fully in front of the wanderer, gazed at him steadfastly in the face. He noticed me not, but resumed his solemn walk, while I, ceasing to follow, remained absorbed in contemplation. "This old man," I said at length, "is the type and the genius of deep crime. He refuses to be alone. He is the man of the crowd. It will be in vain to follow, for I shall learn no more of him, nor of his deeds. The worst heart of the world is a grosser book than the Hortulus Animae. And perhaps it is but one of the great mercies of God that I already forgot what this is. That it cannot be read. Oh, and perhaps it is but one of the great mercies of God that it cannot be read. Ooh, interesting. So we never learn though. So there again is Poe where he leaves you hanging. Oh, so there is along a deep, probably crime-ridden but interesting history in this old man. And luckily, we cannot read it, for it would be just too horrible. Interesting. Okay. That was fun. I quite enjoyed that. The Hortulus anime cum Arantunculus alacriber supereditus. I'll see if I can translate that. Oops. When any garden would advise. And that. So yeah, so hiding in plain sight sort of situation and being able to utilize your surroundings. And it is, there's a different, okay, hang on. There is also, he was talking about at the beginning, the pickpockets, who he found it interesting that no one could tell, even though it seemed so obvious that that's what they were pickpockets. And then there's this guy who is so far in so deep, and is absolutely unnoticeable unless you're really looking for it. Interesting. Okay. All right. Oh no. Okay. So that was The Man of the Crowd. And this one is Never Bet the Devil Your Head, a tale with a moral. And apparently this is a sort of it's satirical and not against, kind of against the notion that all stories must have morals. So we'll see. Should be amusing. Provided the customs of the author, says Don Thomas de las Torres, in the preface to his amatory poems, to be pure and something. Shoot. Okay, hang on. I'm gonna see if I can get the whole thing without it messing up. Okay, as long as the customs of the author are pure and chaste. As long as the customs of the author, says Don Thomas de las Torres in the preface to his amatory poems, are pure and chaste, it matters little that his works are not equally severe. As long as the customs of the author are pure and chaste, it matters little that his works are not equally severe. Okay. Meaning in plain English that provided the morals of an author are pure, personally, it signifies nothing what are the morals of his books. We presume that Don Thomas is now in purgatory for the assertion. It would be a clever thing, too, in the way of poetical justice, to keep him there until his amatory poems get out of print or are laid definitely upon the shelf through lack of readers. Every fiction should have a moral, and what is more to the purpose, the critics have discovered that every fiction has. Philip Melanchthon, some time ago, wrote a commentary upon the Batrachomyomachia, okay, and proved that the poet's object was to excite a distaste for sedition. Pierre Lassagne, going a step farther, shows that the intention was to recommend to young man temperance in eating and drinking. Just so, too, Jacobus Hugo has satisfied himself that, by Eunice, Homer meant to insinuate John Calvin, by Antinous, Martin Luther, by the Lotophagi, Protestants in general, and by the Harpies, the Dutch. Our more modern scholiasts are equally acute. These fellows demonstrate a hidden meaning in The Antediluvians, a parable in Powhatan, new views in Cock Robin, and transcendentalism in Hop o' My Thumb. In short, it has been shown that no man can sit down to write without a very profound design. Thus, to authors in general, much trouble is spared. A novelist, for example, need have no care of his moral. It is there, that is to say, it is somewhere, and the moral and the critics can take care of themselves. When the proper time arrives, all that the gentleman intended, and all that he did not intend, will be brought to light, in the dial, or the downeaster, together with all that he ought to have intended, and the rest that he clearly meant to intend, so that it will all come very straight in the end. I love that so very much. It is. The curtains are blue because they're sad. No, the curtains are blue because they're flipping blue. There is no just ground, therefore, for the charge brought against me by certain ignoramuses, that I have never written a moral tale, or, in more precise words, a tale with a moral. They are not the critics predestined to bring me out and develop my morals. That is the secret. By and by, the North American Quarterly humdrum will make them ashamed of their stupidity. In the meantime, by way of staying execution, by way of mitigating the accusations against me, I offer the sad history appended. A history about whose obvious moral there can be no question whatever, since he who runs may read it in the large capitals which form the title of the tale. I should have credit I should have credit for this arrangement, a far wiser one than that of La Fontaine and others, who reserve the impression to be conveyed until the last moment, and thus sneak it in at the fag end of their fables. That is so funny. So here's the moral. If anyone is questioning whether there's a moral, it's right there in the title. Nobody can say anything about it. He's so funny. I enjoy him so much. I'll see if the Latin comes out. Defuncti injuria ne. Is that French? Of the dead, injury should not be affected by. Of the dead, injury should not be affected by. Okay. Was a law of the 12 tables and of death without. Say nothing but good of the dead is an excellent injunction, even if the dead in question be nothing but dead small beer. It is not my design, therefore, to vituperate. That's a great word. Come back. Is it? Oh my gosh, come on. To vituperate my. Vituperate. Jeez, why? Okay. It is not my design, therefore, to vituperate my deceased friend, Toby Dammit. He was a sad dog, it is true, and a dog's death it was that he died. But he himself was not to blame for his vices. They grew out of a personal defect in his mother. She did her best in the way of flogging him while an infant, for duty. Okay, hang on. Is he actually a dog? I'm thinking he's not. So hang on. Okay, we're going to start back up there. It is not my design, therefore, to vituperate my deceased friend, Toby Dammit. He was a sad dog, it is true, and a dog's death it was that he died. But he himself was not to blame for his vices. They grew out of a personal defect in his mother. She did her best in the way of flogging him while an infant, for duties to her well-regulated mind were always pleasures, and babies, like tough steaks or the modern Greek olive trees, are invariably the better for beating. But poor woman, she had the misfortune to be left-handed, and a child flogged left-handedly had better be left unflogged. The world revolves from right to left. It will not do to whip a baby from left to right. If each blow in the proper direction drives an evil propensity out, it follows that every thump in an opposite one knocks its quota of wickedness in. Oh my God. I was often present at Toby's chastisements, and even by the way in which he kicked, I could perceive that he was getting worse and worse every day. At last I saw, through the tears in my eyes, that there was no hope of the villain at all, and one day, when he had been cuffed until he grew so black in the face that one might have mistaken him for a little African, and no effect had been produced beyond that of making him wriggle himself into a fit, I could stand it no longer, but went down upon my knees forthwith, and uplifting my voice made prophecy of his ruin. The fact is that his precocity in vice was awful. At 5 months of age, he used to get into such passions that he was unable to articulate. At 5 months. At 6 months, I caught him gnawing a pack of cards. At 7 months, he was in the constant habit of catching and kissing the female babies. At 8 months, he peremptorily refused to put his signature to the temperance pledge. At 8 months. Thus he went on increasing in iniquity, month after month, until, at the close of the first year, he not only insisted upon wearing mustaches, but had contracted a propensity for cursing and swearing. End of the first year, cursing and swearing, and for backing his assertions by bets. Through this latter, most ungentlemanly practice, the ruin which I had predicted in Toby Dammit overtook him at last. The fashion had grown with his growth and strengthened with his strength, so that, when he came to be a man, he could scarcely utter a sentence without interlarding it with a proposition to gamble. Not that he actually laid wagers, no. I will do my friend the justice to say that he would as soon have laid eggs. With him the thing was a mere formula, nothing more. His expressions on this head had no meaning attached to them whatever. They were simple, if not altogether innocent expletives, imaginative phrases wherewith to round off a sentence. When he said, "I'll bet you so-and-so," nobody ever thought of taking him up. But still I could not help thinking it my duty to put him down. The habit was an immoral one, and so I told him. It was a vulgar one. This I begged him to believe. It was discountenanced by society. Here I said nothing but the truth. It was forbidden by act of Congress. Here I had not the slightest intention of telling a lie. I remonstrated, but to no purpose. I demonstrated, in vain. I entreated, he smiled. I implored, he laughed. I preached, he sneered. I threatened, he swore. I kicked him, he called for the police. I pulled his nose, he blew it, and offered to bet the devil his head that I would not venture to try that experiment again. All right, here comes the moral. Poverty was another vice which the peculiar physical deficiency of Dammit's mother had entailed upon her son. He was detestably poor, and this was the reason, no doubt, that his expletive expressions about betting seldom took a pecuniary turn. I will not be bound to say that I ever heard him make use of such a figure of speech as, "I'll bet you $1." It was usually, "I'll bet you what you please," or "I'll bet you what you dare," or "I'll bet you a trifle," or else, more significantly still, "I'll bet the devil my head." This latter form seemed to please him best, perhaps because it involved the least risk, for Dammit had become excessively parsimonious. Had anyone taken him up, his head was small, and thus his loss would have been small too. But these are my own reflections, and I am by no means sure that I am right in attributing them to him. At all events, the phrase in question grew daily in favor, notwithstanding the gross impropriety of a man betting his brains like banknotes. But this was a point which my friend's perversity of disposition would not permit him to comprehend. In the end, he abandoned all other forms of wager and gave himself up to "I'll bet the devil my head," with a pertinacity and exclusiveness of devotion that displeased not less than it surprised me. I am always displeased by circumstances for which I cannot account. Mysteries force a man to think, and so injure his health. The truth is, there was something in the air with which Mr. Dammit was wont to give utterance to his offensive expression, something in his manner of enunciation which at first interested and afterwards made me very uneasy. Something which, for want of a more definite term at present, I must be permitted to call queer, but which Mr. Coleridge would have called mystical, Mr. Kant pantheistical, Mr. Carlyle twistical, and Mr. Emerson hyperquisitistical. Oh my gosh, I love this so much. Hyperquisitistical. Please tell me that they've made it an actual word. Dang it. Or should I say damn it? I began not to like it at all. Mr. Dammit's soul was in a perilous state. I resolved to bring all my eloquence into play to save it. I vowed to serve him as St. Patrick, in the Irish Chronicle, is said to have served the toad. That is to say, whoopsie-daisy, awaken him to a sense of his situation. Gosh darn it, come back. When I had made an end, I addressed myself to the task forthwith. Once more I betook myself to remonstrance. Again I collected my energies for a final attempt at expostulation. When I had made an end of my lecture, Mr. Dammit indulged himself in some very equivocal behavior. For some moments he remained silent, merely looking me inquisitively in the face, but presently he threw his head to one side and elevated his eyebrows to great extent. Then he spread out the palms of his hands and shrugged up his shoulders. Then he winked with the right eye. Then he repeated the operation with the left. Then he shut them both up very tight. Then he opened them both so very wide that I became seriously alarmed for the consequences. Then, applying his thumb to his nose, he thought proper to make an indescribable movement with the rest of his fingers. Finally, setting his arms akimbo, he condescended to reply. I can call to mind only the heads of his discourse. He would be obliged to me if I would hold my tongue. He wished none of my advice. He despised all my insinuations. He was old enough to take care of himself. Did I still think him baby, damn it? Did I mean to say anything against his character? Did I intend to insult him? Was I a fool? Was my maternal parent aware, in a word, of my absence from the domiciliary residence? He would put this latter question to me as to a man of veracity, and he would bind himself to abide by my reply. Once more he would demand explicitly if my mother knew that I was out. My confusion, he said, betrayed me, and he would be willing to bet the devil his head that she did not. Mr. Dammit did not pause for my rejoinder. Turning upon his heel, he left my presence with undignified precipitation. It was well for him that he did so. My feelings had been wounded. Even my anger had been aroused. For once I would have taken him up upon his insulting wager. I would have won for the arch-enemy Mr. Dammit's little head. For the fact is, my mamma was very well aware of my merely temporary absence from home. But Kodashifa Midahid. But something. Heaven gives relief. That's probably what it means. As the Mussulmen say when you tread upon their toes, it was in pursuance of my duty that I had been insulted, and I bore the insult like a man. It now seemed to me, however, that I had done all that could be required of me in the case of this miserable individual, and I resolved to trouble him no longer with my counsel, but to leave him to his conscience and himself. But although I forbore to intrude with my advice, I could not bring myself to give up his society altogether. I even went so far as to humor some of his less reprehensible propensities, and there were times when I found myself lauding his wicked jokes as epicures do mustard, with tears in my eyes. So profoundly did it grieve me to hear his evil talk. One fine day, having strolled out together, arm in arm, our route led us in the direction of a river. There was a bridge, and we resolved to cross it. It was roofed over by way of protection from the weather, and the archway, having but few windows, was thus very uncomfortably dark. As we entered the passage, the contrast between the external glare and the interior gloom struck heavily upon my spirits. Not so upon those of the unhappy Dammit, who offered to bet the devil his head that I was hit. He seemed to be in an unusual good humor. He was excessively lively, so much so that I entertained I know not what of uneasy suspicion. It is not impossible that he was affected with the transcendentals. I am not well enough versed, however, in the diagnosis of this disease to speak with decision upon the point, and unhappily there were none of my friends of the dial present. I suggest the idea, nevertheless, because of a certain species of austere Merry Andrewism, which seemed to beset my poor friend, and caused him to make quite a tomfool of himself. Nothing would serve him but wriggling and skipping about under and over everything that came in his way, now shouting out, and now lisping out, all manner of odd little and big words, yet preserving the gravest face in the world all the time. I really could not make up my mind whether to kick or to pity him. At length, having passed nearly across the bridge, we approached the termination of the footway, when our progress was impeded by a turnstile of some height. Through this I made my way quietly, pushing it around as usual. But this turn would not serve the turn. But this turn would not serve the turn of Mr. Dammit. He insisted upon leaping the stile, and said he could cut a pigeon wing over it in the air. Now this conscientiously? Was that conscientiously? Blah! Now this conscientiously speaking, I did not think he could do. The best pigeon winger over all kinds of style was my friend Mr. Carlyle, and as I knew he could not do it, I would not believe that it could be done by Toby Dammit. I therefore told him in so many words that he was a braggadocio, and could not do what he said. For this I had reason to be sorry afterwards, for he straightway offered to bet the devil his head that he could. I was about to reply, notwithstanding my previous resolutions, with some remonstrance against his impiety, when I heard, close at my elbow, a slight cough, which sounded very much like the ejaculation "ahem." I started and looked about me in surprise. My glance at length fell into a nook of the framework of the bridge, upon the figure of a little lame old gentleman of venerable aspect. Nothing could be more reverend than his whole appearance, for he not only had on a full suit of black, but his shirt was perfectly clean, and the collar turned very neatly down over a white cravat, while his hair was parted in front like a girl's. His hands were clasped pensively together over his stomach, and his 2 eyes were carefully rolled up into the top of his head. Upon observing him more closely, I perceived that he wore a black silk apron over his small clothes, and this was a thing which I thought very odd. Before I had time to make any remark, however, upon so singular a circumstance, he interrupted me with a second ahem. To this observation I was not immediately prepared to reply. The fact is, remarks of this laconic nature are nearly unanswerable. I have known a quarterly review nonplussed by the word fudge. I am not ashamed to say, therefore, that I turned to Mr. Dammit for assistance. "Damn it," said I, "what are you about? Don't you hear? The gentleman says ahem." I looked sternly at my friend while I thus addressed him, for to say the truth I felt particularly puzzled, and when a man is particularly puzzled he must knit his brows and look savage, or else he is pretty sure to look like a fool. "Damn it," observed I, although this sounded very much like an oath, than which nothing was farther from my thoughts. "Damn it," I suggested, "the gentleman says ahem." I do not attempt to defend my remark on the score of profundity. I did not think it profound myself. Damn it, the gentleman says ahem. I do not attempt to defend my remark on the score of profundity. I did not think it profound myself, but I have noticed that the effect of our speeches is not always proportionate with their importance in our own eyes. See, he's got morals all throughout without meaning to, or maybe he does mean to. And if I had shot Mr. D through and through with a Paxson bomb, or knocked him in the head with the poets and poetry of America, he could hardly have been more discomfited than when I addressed him with those simple words. "Damn it, what are you about? Don't you hear? The gentleman says ahem." "You don't say so," gasped he at length, after turning more colors than a pirate runs up, one after the other, when chased by a man of war. "Are you quite sure he said that? Well, at all events, I am in for it now, and may as well put a bold face upon the matter. Here goes, then. Ahem." At this, the little old gentleman seemed pleased. God only knows why. He left his station at the nook of the bridge, limped forward with a gracious air, took Dammit by the hand and shook it cordially, looking all the way straight up in his face with an air of the most unadulterated benignity which it is possible for the mind of man to imagine. "I am quite sure you will win it, Dammit," said he with the frankest of all smiles. "But we are obliged to have a trial, you know, for the sake of mere form." "Ahem," replied my friend, taking off his coat with a deep sigh, tying a pocket handkerchief around his waist, and producing an unaccountable alteration in his countenance by twisting up his eyes and bringing down the corners of his mouth. "Ahem, and ahem," said he again after a pause, and not another word more than ahem did I ever know him to say after that. Aha, thought I, without expressing myself aloud, this is quite a remarkable silence on the part of Toby Dammit, and is no doubt a consequence of his verbosity upon a previous occasion. One extreme induces another. I wonder if he has forgotten the many unanswerable questions which he propounded to me so fluently on the day when I gave him my last lecture. At all events, he is cured of the transcendentals. And then I like this one as well. Look at all these morals littered throughout this story that only has one moral. "Ahem," here replied Toby, just as if he had been reading my thoughts, and looking like a very old sheep in a reverie. The old gentleman now took him by the arm, and led him more into the shade of the bridge, a few paces back from the turnstile. "My good fellow," said he, "I make it a point of conscience to allow you this much run. Wait here till I take my place by the stile, so that I may see whether you go over it handsomely and transcendentally, and don't omit any flourishes of the pigeon wing. A mere form, you know. I will say 1, 2, 3, and away. Mind you start at the word away." Here he took his position by the stile, paused a moment as if in profound reflection, then looked up, and, I thought, smiled very slightly, then tightened the strings of his apron, then took a long look at Dammit, and finally gave the word, as agreed upon. 1, 2, 3, and away. Punctually at the word away, my poor friend set off in a strong gallop. The stile was not very high, like Mr. Lord's, nor yet very low, like that of Mr. Lord's reviewers, but upon the whole I made sure that he would clear it. And then, what if he did not? Ah, that was the question. What if he did not? "What right," said I, "had the old gentleman to make any other gentleman jump? The little old dot and carry one. Who is he? If he asks me to jump, I won't do it. That's flat, and I don't care who the devil he is." The bridge, as I say, was arched and covered in a very ridiculous manner, and there was a most uncomfortable echo about it at all times. an echo which I never before so particularly observed as when I uttered the 4 last words of my remark. Oh, okay, the devil he is. But what I said, or what I thought, or what I heard occupied only an instant. In less than 5 seconds from his starting, my poor Toby had taken the leap. I saw him run nimbly and spring grandly from the floor of the bridge, cutting the most awful flourishes with his wings as he went up. I saw him high in the air, pigeon-winging it to admiration just over the top of the stile. And of course I thought it an unusually singular thing that he did not continue to go over. But the whole leap was the affair of a moment, and before I had a chance to make any profound reflections, down came Mr. Dammit on the flat of his back, on the same side of the stile from which he had started. At the same instant, I saw the old gentleman limping off at the top of his speed, having caught and wrapped up in his apron something that fell heavily into it from the darkness of the arch just over the turnstile. At all this I was much astonished, but I had no leisure to think, for Mr. Dammit lay particularly still, and I concluded that his feelings had been hurt, and that he stood in need of my assistance. I hurried up to him and found that he had received what might be termed a serious injury. The truth is, he had been deprived of his head, which after a close search I could not find anywhere. So I determined to take him home and send for the homeopathists. In the meantime, a thought struck me, and I threw open an adjacent window of the bridge, when the sad truth flashed upon me at once. About 5 feet just above the top of the turnstile, and crossing the arch of the footpath so as to constitute a brace, there extended a flat iron bar, lying with its breadth horizontally, and forming one of a series that served to strengthen the structure throughout its extent. With the edge of this brace, it appeared evident that the neck of my unfortunate friend had come precisely in contact. He did not long survive his terrible loss. The homeopathists did not give him little enough physic, and what little they did give him, he hesitated to take. So in the end he grew worse, and at length died, a lesson to all riotous livers. A lesion? To all riotous livers. I bedewed his grave with my tears, worked a bar sinister on his family escutcheon, and for the general expenses of his funeral, sent in my very moderate bill to the transcendentalists. The scoundrels refused to pay it, so I had Mr. Dammit dug up at once and sold him for dog's meat. Whoa! It was funny. I was thinking, as we were reading here, that usually Poe has it kind of right at the end where it just throws something at you. And I assumed that would have been the head part, which it came close to the end, but there was still that denouement at the end. And then all of a sudden you're going to dig him up and sell him for dog's meat. There it is. That was so funny. I enjoyed that so much, and I love finding writing. See, this is the thing, is a lot of this stuff, if you don't read it in the correct tone, it seems dry, it seems old-fashioned, it seems all that. But when you actually read it in the tone that it's meant to be read in, it's perfect. And it's hilarious. And oh, I love it. I love it very, very much. So yes, moral of the story, never bet the devil your head. And I did. I had, as soon as this part where it said, oh, who the devil he is, the bridge, as I say, was arched and covered in, obviously. And then, yeah, and that's something too, like I think all of the worst types of humor are my favorite types of humor. Dark, dirty, and dry, if that's it. Yeah, are all my favorite types of humor. So like this one, where he's just talking about it so nonchalantly, so dryly, and sarcastically. Oh, it's so funny. I love it so much. Anyway, that was fantastic. Mr. Dammit. Anyway. Yes, so that was Never Bet the Devil Your Head. This is about to be Thou Art the Man. And I'm trying... Oh, and I want to say this one was, at one point, it had an exclamation point in it. So it's like, Thou Art the Man. But it's like... I think it's kind of like you the man sort of thing, but it's thou art the man, which I find incredibly amusing, as per usual. I don't remember what it's supposed to be about. I just looked at it earlier, like a few hours ago, but I've already forgotten. So we'll find out. Thou art the man. I will now play the Oedipus to the Rattleborough Enigma. I will. Oh, it's a detective one. This is a detective one. Yes, it's a detective one. That's all I know. Thou art the man. I will now play the Oedipus to the Rattleborough Enigma. I will expound to you, as I alone can, the secret of the enginery that effected the Rattleborough miracle. The one, the true, the admitted, the undisputed, the indisputable miracle, which put a definite end to infidelity among the Rattleburgers, and converted to the orthodoxy of the grandams all the carnal-minded who had ventured to be skeptical before. This event, which I should be sorry to discuss in a tone of unsuitable levity, occurred in the summer of 18. Mr. Barnabas Shuttleworthy, one of the wealthiest and most respectable citizens of the borough, had been missing for several days under circumstances which gave rise to suspicion of foul play. Mr. Shuttleworthy had set out from Rattleborough very early one Saturday morning on horseback with the avowed intention of proceeding to the city of blank, about 15 miles distant and of returning the night of the same day. 2 hours after his departure, however, his horse returned without him, and without the saddlebags which had been strapped on his back at starting. The animal was wounded, too, and covered with mud. These circumstances naturally gave rise to much alarm among the friends of the missing man, and when it was found on Sunday morning that he had not yet made his appearance, the whole borough arose en masse to go and look for his body. The foremost and most energetic in instituting this search was the... Okay, I'm just trying to figure out if the names mean anything. The foremost and most energetic in instituting this search was the bosom friend of Mr. Shuttleworthy, a Mr. Charles Goodfellow, or as he was universally called, Charlie Goodfellow, or Old Charlie Goodfellow. Now, whether it is a marvelous coincidence, or whether it is that the name itself has an imperceptible effect upon the character, I have never yet been able to ascertain, but the fact is unquestionable that there never yet was any person named Charles who was not an open, manly, honest, good-natured, and frank-hearted fellow, with a rich, clear voice that did you good to hear it, and an eye that looked you always straight in the face, as much as to say, I have a clear conscience myself, am afraid of no man, and am altogether above doing a mean action. And thus all the hardy, careless, walking gentlemen of the stage are very certain to be called Charles. Now, old Charlie Goodfellow, although he had been in Rattleborough not longer than 6 months or thereabouts, and although nobody knew anything about him before he came to settle in the neighborhood, had experienced no difficulty in the world in making the acquaintance of all the respectable people in the borough. Not a man of them but would have taken his bare word for 1,000 at any moment, and as for the women, there is no saying what they would not have done to oblige him. And all this came of his having been christened Charles, and of his possessing, in consequence, that ingenuous face which is proverbially the very best letter of recommendation. I have already said that Mr. Shuttleworthy was one of the most respectable, and undoubtedly he was the most wealthy man in Rattleborough, while old Charlie Goodfellow was upon as intimate terms with him as if he had been his own brother. The two old gentlemen were next-door neighbors, and although Mr. Shuttleworthy seldom, if ever, visited old Charlie, and never was known to take a meal in his house, still this did not prevent the two friends from being exceedingly intimate, as I have just observed. For old Charlie never let a day pass without stepping in 3 or 4 times to see how his neighbor came on, and very often he would stay to breakfast or tea, and almost always to dinner, and then the amount of wine that was made way with by the 2 cronies at a sitting, it would really be a difficult thing to ascertain. Old Charlie's favorite beverage was Chateau Margaux, and it appeared to do Mr. Shuttleworthy's heart good to see the old fellow swallow it, as he did quart after quart, so that one day, when the wine was in and the wit, as a natural consequence, somewhat out, he said to his crony, as he slapped him upon the back, I tell you what it is, old Charlie, you are, by all odds, the heartiest old fellow I ever came across in all my born days. And since you love to guzzle the wine at that fashion, I'll be darned if I don't have to make thee a present of a big box of the Chateau Margaux. Odd rot me? Odd rot me. Mr. Shuttleworthy had a sad habit of swearing, although he seldom went beyond odd rot me, or by gosh, or by the jolly golly. Odd rot me, says he, if I don't send an order to town this very afternoon for a double box of the best that can be got, and I'll make ye a present of it, I will. Ye needn't say a word now, I will, I tell ye, and there's an end of it. So look out for it. It will come to hand some of these fine days, precisely when ye are looking for it the least. I loved this. When the wine was in and the wit, as a natural consequence, somewhat out. Isn't that how it works? I mentioned this little bit of liberality on the part of Mr. Shuttleworthy, just by way of showing you how very intimate an understanding existed between the two friends. Well, on the Sunday morning in question, when it came to be fairly understood that Mr. Shuttleworthy had met with foul play, I never saw anyone so profoundly affected as old Charlie Goodfellow. When he first heard that the horse had come home without his master, and without his master's saddlebags, and all bloody from a pistol shot that had gone clean through and through the poor animal's chest without quite killing him, when he heard all this, he turned as pale as if the missing man had been his own dear brother or father, and shivered and shook all over as if he had had a fit of the ague. Pretty sure that's how you say it. At first, he was too much overpowered with grief to be able to do anything at all, or to decide upon any plan of action, so that for a long time he endeavored to dissuade Mr. Shuttleworthy's other friends from making a stir about the matter, thinking it best to wait a while, say for a week or two, or a month or two, to see if something wouldn't turn up, or if Mr. Shuttleworthy wouldn't come in the natural way, and explain his reasons for sending his horse on before. I dare say you have often observed this disposition to temporize or to procrastinate in people who are laboring under any very poignant sorrow. Their powers of mind seem to be rendered torpid, so that they have a horror of anything like action, and like nothing in the world so well as to lie quietly in bed and nurse their grief, as the old ladies express it, that is to say, ruminate over their trouble. The people of Rattleborough had indeed so high an opinion of the wisdom and discretion of old Charlie that the greater part of them felt disposed to agree with him and not make a stir in the business until something should turn up. As the honest old gentleman worded it, and I believe that, after all, this would have been the general determination, but for the very suspicious interference of Mr. Shuttleworthy's nephew, a young man of very dissipated habits and otherwise of rather bad character. This nephew, whose name was Pennyfeather, would listen to nothing like reason in the matter of lying quiet, but insisted upon making immediate search for the corpse of the murdered man. This was the expression he employed, and Mr. Goodfellow acutely remarked at the time that it was a singular expression, to say no more. This remark of old Charlie's, too, had great effect upon the crowd, and one of the party was heard to ask very impressively how it happened that young Mr. Pennyfeather was so intimately cognizant of all the circumstances connected with his wealthy uncle's disappearance, as to feel authorized to assert distinctly and unequivocally that his uncle was a murdered man. Hereupon some little squibbing and bickering occurred among various members of the crowd, and especially between old Charlie and Mr. Pennyfeather, although this latter occurrence was, indeed, by no means a novelty, for little goodwill had subsisted between the parties for the last 3 or 4 months, and matters had even gone so far that Mr. Pennyfeather had actually knocked down his uncle's friend for some alleged excess of liberty that the latter had taken in the uncle's house, of which the nephew was an inmate. Upon this occasion, old Charlie is said to have behaved with exemplary moderation and Christian charity. He arose from the blow, adjusted his clothes, and made no attempt at retaliation at all, merely muttering a few words about taking summary vengeance at the first convenient opportunity. A natural and very justifiable ebullition of anger, which meant nothing, however, and beyond doubt was no sooner given vent to than forgotten. I'm sure. However these matters may be, which have no reference to the point now at issue, it is quite certain that the people of Rattleborough, principally through the persuasion of Mr. Pennyfeather, came at length to the determination of dispersing over the adjacent country in search of the missing Mr. Shuttleworthy. I say they came to this determination in the first instance. After it had been fully resolved that a search should be made, it was considered almost a matter of course that the seekers should disperse. that is to say, distribute themselves in parties for the more thorough examination of the region round about. I forget, however, by what ingenious train of reasoning it was that old Charlie finally convinced the assembly that this was the most injudicious plan that could be pursued. Convince them, however, he did, all except Mr. Pennyfeather. And in the end, it was arranged that a search should be instituted carefully and very thoroughly by the burghers en masse, old Charlie himself leading the way. As for the matter of that, there could have been no better pioneer than old Charlie, whom everybody knew to have the eye of a lynx. But although he led them into all manner of out-of-the-way holes and corners by routes that nobody had ever suspected of existing in the neighborhood, and although the search was incessantly kept up day and night for nearly a week, still no trace of Mr. Shuttleworthy could be discovered. When I say no trace, however, I must not be understood to speak literally, for trace to some extent there certainly was. The poor gentleman had been tracked by his horse's shoes, which were peculiar, to a spot about 3 miles to the east of the borough, on the main road leading to the city. Here the track made off into a bypath through a piece of woodland, the path coming out again into the main road and cutting off about half a mile of the regular distance. Following the shoe marks down this lane, the party came at length to a pool of stagnant water, half hidden by the brambles to the right of the lane, and opposite this pool all vestige of the track was lost sight of. It appeared, however, that a struggle of some nature had here taken place, and it seemed as if some large and heavy body, much larger and heavier than a man, had been drawn from the bypath to the pool. This latter was carefully dragged twice, but nothing was found, and the party were upon the point of going away, in despair of coming to any result, when Providence suggested to Mr. Goodfellow the expediency of draining the water off altogether. This project was received with cheers and many high compliments to old Charlie upon his sagacity and consideration. As many of the burghers had brought spades with them, supposing that they might possibly be called upon to disinter a corpse, the drain was easily and speedily effected, and no sooner was the bottom visible than right in the middle of the mud that remained was discovered a black silk velvet waistcoat, which nearly everyone present immediately recognized as the property of Mr. Pennyfeather. This waistcoat was much torn and stained with blood, and there were several persons among the party who had a distinct remembrance of its having been worn by its owner on the very morning of Mr. Shuttleworthy's departure for the city, while there were others again ready to testify upon oath, if required, that Mr. P. did not wear the garment in question at any period during the remainder of that memorable day. Nor could anyone be found to say that he had seen it upon Mr. P.'s person at any period at all subsequent to Mr. Shuttleworthy's disappearance. Matters now wore a very serious aspect for Mr. Pennyfeather, and it was observed as an indubitable confirmation of the suspicions which were excited against him that he grew exceedingly pale, and when asked what he had to say for himself, was utterly incapable of saying a word. Hereupon the few friends his riotous mode of living had left him deserted him at once to a man, and were even more clamorous than his ancient and avowed enemies for his instantaneous arrest. But on the other hand, the magnanimity of Mr. Goodfellow shone forth with only the more brilliant luster through contrast. He made a warm and intensely eloquent defense of Mr. Pennyfeather, in which he alluded more than once to his own sincere forgiveness of that wild young gentleman, the heir of the worthy Mr. Goodfellow, for the insult which, clearly not forgotten, which he, the young man, had no doubt in the heat of passion thought proper to put upon him, Mr. Goodfellow. He forgave him for it, he said, from the very bottom of his heart and the bottom of the pool, and for himself, Mr. Goodfellow, so far from pushing the suspicious circumstances to extremity, which, he was sorry to say, really had arisen against Mr. Pennyfeather, he, Mr. Goodfellow, would make every exertion in his power, would employ all the little eloquence in his possession to soften down, as much as he could conscientiously do so, the worst features of this really exceedingly perplexing piece of business. Mr. Goodfellow went on for some half-hour longer in this strain, very much to the credit both of his head and of his heart. But your warm-hearted people are seldom apt in the circumstances or in relation to something. Are seldom apposite in their observations. They run into all sorts of blunders, contretemps, and malaproposisms. Mishaps and badly aproposisms. They run into all sorts of blunders, contretemps, and malaproposisms in the hot-headedness of their zeal to serve a friend, thus often with the kindest intentions in the world, doing infinitely more to prejudice his cause than to advance it. Interesting. So in the present instance, it turned out with all the eloquence of old Charlie, for although he labored earnestly in behalf of the suspected, yet it so happened, somehow or other, that every syllable he uttered, of which the direct but unwitting tendency was not to exalt the speaker in the good opinion of his audience, had the effect of deepening the suspicion already attached to the individual whose cause he pled, and of arousing against him the fury of the mob. One of the most unaccountable errors committed by the orator was his allusion to the suspected as the heir of the worthy old gentleman, Mr. Goodfellow. The people had really never thought of this before. They had only remembered certain threats of disinheritance uttered a year or two previously by the uncle, who had no living relative except the nephew, and they had, therefore, always looked upon this disinheritance as a matter that was settled. So single-minded a race of beings were the Rattleburgers. Yes. But the remark of old Charlie brought them at once to a consideration of this point, and thus gave them to see the possibility of the threats having been nothing more than a threat. And straightway hereupon arose the natural question of cui bono? Helpful. A question that tended even more than the waistcoat to fasten the terrible crime upon the young man. And here, lest I be misunderstood, permit me to digress for one moment, merely to observe that the exceedingly brief and simple Latin phrase which I have employed is invariably mistranslated and misconceived. Cui bono, in all the crack novels and elsewhere, in those of Mrs. Gore, for example, the author of Cecil, a lady who quotes all tongues from the Chaldean to the Chickasaw, and is helped to her learning, as needed, upon a systematic plan by Mr. Beckford. In all the crack novels, I say, from those of Bulwer and Dickens to those of Turnapenny and Ainsworth, the two little Latin words cui bono are rendered to what purpose, or, as if quo bono, to what good. Their true meaning, nevertheless, is for whose advantage. Qui, to whom, bono, is it for a benefit. It is a purely legal phrase and applicable precisely in cases such as we have now under consideration, where the probability of the doer of a deed hinges upon the probability of the benefit accruing to this individual, or to that from the deed's accomplishment. Now, in the present instance, the question cui bono very pointedly implicated Mr. Pennyfeather. His uncle had threatened him, after making a will in his favor, with a disinheritance, but the threat had not been actually kept. The original will, it appeared, had not been altered. Had it been altered, the only supposable motive for murder on the part of the suspected would have been the ordinary one of revenge. And even this would have been counteracted by the hope of reinstation into the good graces of the uncle. But the will being unaltered, while the threat to alter remained suspended over the nephew's head, there appears at once the very strongest possible inducement for the atrocity, and so concluded, very sagaciously, the worthy citizens of the borough of Rattle. Mr. Pennyfeather was, accordingly, arrested upon the spot, and the crowd, after some farther search, proceeded homewards, having him in custody. On the route, however, another circumstance occurred tending to confirm the suspicion entertained. Mr. Goodfellow, whose zeal led him to be always a little in advance of the party, was seen suddenly to run forward a few paces, stoop, and then apparently to pick up some small object from the grass. Having quickly examined it, he was observed, too, to make a sort of half-attempt at concealing it in his coat pocket. But this action was noticed, as I say, and consequently prevented, when the object picked up was found to be a Spanish knife, which a dozen persons at once recognized as belonging to Mr. Pennyfeather. Moreover, his initials were engraved upon the handle. The blade of this knife was open and bloody. No doubt now remained of the guilt of the nephew, and immediately upon reaching Rattleborough he was taken before a magistrate for examination. Here matters again took a most unfavorable turn. The prisoner, being questioned as to his whereabouts on the morning of Mr. Shuttleworthy's disappearance, had absolutely the audacity to acknowledge that on that very morning he had been out with his rifle deer-stalking in the immediate neighborhood of the pool, where the blood-stained waistcoat had been discovered through the sagacity of Mr. Goodfellow. This latter now came forward, and with tears in his eyes asked permission to be examined. He said that a stern sense of the duty he owed his Maker, not less than his fellow men, would permit him no longer to remain silent. Hitherto, the sincerest affection for the young man, notwithstanding the latter's ill treatment of himself, Mr. Goodfellow, had induced him to make every hypothesis which imagination could suggest, by way of endeavoring to account for what appeared suspicious in the circumstances that told so seriously against Mr. Pennyfeather. But these circumstances were now altogether too convincing, too damning. He would hesitate no longer. He would tell all he knew, although his heart, Mr. Goodfellow's, should absolutely burst asunder in the effort. He then went on to state that, on the afternoon of the day previous to Mr. Shuttleworthy's departure for the city, that worthy old gentleman had mentioned to his nephew, in his hearing, Mr. Goodfellow's, that his object in going to town on the morrow was to make a deposit of an unusually large sum of money in the Farmers' and Mechanics' Bank, and that, then and there, the said Mr. Shuttleworthy had distinctly avowed to the said nephew his irrevocable determination of rescinding the will originally made, and of cutting him off with a shilling. He, the witness, now solemnly called upon the accused to state whether what he, the witness, had just stated was or was not the truth in every substantial particular. Much to the astonishment of everyone present, Mr. Pennyfeather frankly admitted that it was. The magistrate now considered it his duty to send a couple of constables to search the chamber of the accused in the house of his uncle. From this search they almost immediately returned with the well-known steel-bound russet-leather pocketbook which the old gentleman had been in the habit of carrying for years. Its valuable contents, however, had been abstracted, and the magistrate in vain endeavored to extort from the prisoner the use which had been made of them, or the place of their concealment. Indeed, he obstinately denied all knowledge of the matter. The constables also discovered, between the bed and sacking of the unhappy man, a shirt and neck handkerchief, both marked with the initials of his victim, and both hideously besmeared with the blood of the victim. A shirt and neck handkerchief, both marked with the initials of his name, and both hideously besmeared with the blood of the victim. At this juncture, it was announced that the horse of the murdered man had just expired in the stable from the effects of the wound he had received, and it was proposed by Mr. Goodfellow that a post-mortem examination of the beast should be immediately made, with the view, if possible, of discovering the ball. This was accordingly done, and as if to demonstrate beyond a question the guilt of the accused, Mr. Goodfellow, after considerable searching in the cavity of the chest, was enabled to detect and to pull forth a bullet of very extraordinary size, which, upon trial, was found to be exactly adapted to the bore of Mr. Pennyfeather's rifle, while it was far too large for that of any other person in the borough or its vicinity. To render the matter even surer yet, however, this bullet was discovered to have a flaw or seam at right angles to the usual suture, and upon examination, this seam corresponded precisely with an accidental ridge or elevation in a pair of molds, acknowledged by the accused himself to be his own property. Upon the finding of this bullet, the examining magistrate refused to listen to any farther testimony, and immediately committed the prisoner for trial, declining resolutely to take any bail in the case, although against this severity Mr. Goodfellow very warmly remonstrated, and offered to become surety in whatever amount might be required. This generosity on the part of old Charlie was only in accordance with the whole tenor of his amiable and chivalrous conduct during the entire period of his sojourn in the borough of Rattle. In the present instance, the worthy man was so entirely carried away by the excessive warmth of his sympathy that he seemed to have quite forgotten, when he offered to go bail for his young friend, that he himself, Mr. Goodfellow, did not possess a single dollar's worth of property upon the face of the earth. Doesn't he? The result of the committal may be readily foreseen. Mr. Pennyfeather, amid the loud execrations of all Rattleborough, was brought to trial at the next criminal sessions, when the chain of circumstantial evidence, strengthened as it was by some additional damning facts, which Mr. Goodfellow's sensitive conscientiousness forbade him to withhold from the court, was considered so unbroken and so thoroughly conclusive that the jury, without leaving their seats, returned an immediate verdict of guilty of murder in the first degree. Soon afterwards, the unhappy wretch received sentence of death and was remanded to the county jail to await the inexorable vengeance of the law. In the meantime, the noble behavior of old Charlie Goodfellow had doubly endeared him to the honest citizens of the borough. He became 10 times a greater favorite than ever, and as a natural result of the hospitality with which he was treated, he relaxed, as it were, perforce, the extremely parsimonious habits which his poverty had hitherto impelled him to observe, and very frequently had little reunions at his own house, when wit and jollity reigned supreme, dampened a little, of course, by the occasional remembrance of the untoward and melancholy fate which impended over the nephew of the late lamented bosom friend of the generous host. One fine day, this magnanimous old gentleman was agreeably surprised at the receipt of the following letter. Charles Goodfellow. Wait, okay, hang on. Charles Goodfellow, Esquire, Rattleborough from blah, 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 blah. Charles Goodfellow. Right. Charles Goodfellow, Esquire. Dear Sir, in conformity with an order transmitted to our firm about 2 months since by our esteemed correspondent, Mr. Barnabas Shuttleworthy, we have the honor of forwarding this morning to your address a double box of Chateau Margaux of the Antelope brand, violet seal, box numbered and marked as per margin. We remain, sir, your most obedient servants, Hogs, Frogs, Boggs & Co. City of Blank, June 21st, 18 Bull. P.S. The box will reach you by wagon on the day after your receipt of this letter. Our respects to Mr. Shuttleworthy, HFB & Co. The fact is that Mr. Goodfellow had, since the death of Mr. Shuttleworthy, given over all expectation of ever receiving the promised Chateau Margaux, and he therefore looked upon it now as a sort of a special dispensation of Providence in his behalf. He was highly delighted, of course, and in the exuberance of his joy, invited a large party of friends to a petite supper, or just gathering. A small supper, on the morrow, for the purpose of broaching the good old Mr. Shuttleworthy's present. Not that he said anything about the good old Mr. Shuttleworthy when he issued the invitations. The fact is, he thought much and concluded to say nothing at all. He did not mention to anyone, if I remember aright, that he had received a present of Chateau Margaux. He merely asked his friends to come and help him drink some of a remarkably fine quality and rich flavor that he had ordered up from the city a couple of months ago, and of which he would be in the receipt upon the morrow. I have often puzzled myself to imagine why it was that old Charlie came to the conclusion to say nothing about having received the wine from his old friend, but I could never precisely understand his reason for the silence, although he had some excellent and very magnanimous reason, no doubt. The morrow at length arrived, and with it a very large and highly respectable company at Mr. Goodfellow's house. Indeed, half the borough was there, I myself among the number, but much to the vexation of the host, the Chateau Margaux did not arrive until a late hour, and when the sumptuous supper supplied by old Charlie had been done very ample justice by the guests. It came at length, however, a monstrously big box of it there was, too, and as the whole party were in excessively good humor, it was decided, nemcon, that it should be lifted upon the table and its contents disemboweled forthwith. No sooner said than done. I lent a helping hand, and in a trice we had the box upon the table, in the midst of all the bottles and glasses, not a few of which were demolished in the scuffle. Old Charlie, who was pretty much intoxicated and excessively red in the face, now took a seat, with an air of mock dignity, at the head of the board, and thumped furiously upon it with a decanter, calling upon the company to keep order during the ceremony of disinterring the treasure. After some vociferation, quiet was at length fully restored, as very often happens in similar cases. A profound and remarkable silence ensued. Being then requested to force open the lid, I complied, of course, with an infinite deal of pleasure. I inserted a chisel, and giving it a few slight taps with a hammer, the top of the box flew suddenly and violently off, and at the same instant there sprang up into a sitting position directly facing the host the bruised, bloody, and nearly putrid corpse of the murdered Mr. Shuttleworthy himself. It gazed for a few moments, fixedly and sorrowfully, with its decaying and lackluster eyes, full into the countenance of Mr. Goodfellow, uttered slowly but clearly and impressively the words, "Thou art the man," and then falling over the side of the chest as if thoroughly satisfied, stretched out its limbs quiveringly upon the table. The scene that ensued is altogether beyond description. The rush for the doors and windows was terrific, and many of the most robust men in the room fainted outright through sheer horror. But after the first wild, shrieking burst of affright, all eyes were directed to Mr. Goodfellow. If I live 1,000 years, I can never forget the more than mortal agony which was depicted in that ghastly face of his, so lately rubicund with triumph and wine. For several minutes he sat rigidly as a statue of marble, his eyes seeming, in the intense vacancy of their gaze, to be turned inwards and absorbed in the contemplation of his own miserable, murderous soul. At length their expression appeared to flash suddenly out into the external world, when with a quick leap he sprang from his chair, and falling heavily with his head and shoulders upon the table, and in contact with the corpse, poured out rapidly and vehemently a detailed confession of the hideous crime for which Mr. Pennyfeather was then imprisoned and doomed to die. What he recounted was in substance this. He followed his victim to the vicinity of the pool, there shot his horse with a pistol, dispatched the rider with its butt end, possessed himself of the pocketbook, and, supposing the horse dead, dragged it with great labor to the brambles by the pond. Upon his own beast he slung the corpse of Mr. Shuttleworthy, and thus bore it to a secure place of concealment, a long distance off through the woods. The waistcoat, the knife, the pocketbook, and bullet had been placed by himself where found, with the view of avenging himself upon Mr. Pennyfeather, called it. He had also contrived the discovery of the stained handkerchief and shirt. Towards the end of the blood-chilling recital, the words of the guilty wretch faltered and grew hollow. When the record was finally exhausted, he arose, staggered backwards from the table, and fell dead. The means by which this happily timed confession was extorted, although efficient, were simple indeed. Mr. Goodfellow's excess of frankness had disgusted me and excited my suspicions from the first. I was present when Mr. Pennyfeather had struck him, and the fiendish expression which then arose upon his countenance. Wait, what? Hang on! The means by which this happily timed confession was extorted, although efficient, were simple indeed. Mr. Goodfellow's excess of frankness had disgusted me and excited my suspicions from the first. I was present when Mr. Pennyfeather had struck him, and the fiendish expression which then arose upon his countenance, although momentary, assured me that his threat of vengeance would, if possible, be rigidly fulfilled. I was thus prepared to view the maneuvering of old Charlie in a very different light from that in which it was regarded by the good citizens of Rattleborough. I saw at once that all the criminating discoveries arose, either directly or indirectly, from himself. But the fact which clearly opened my eyes to the true state of the case was the affair of the bullet found by Mr. G in the carcass of the horse. I had not forgotten, although the Rattleburghers had, that there was a hole where the ball had entered the horse and another where it went out. If it were found in the animal then, after having made its exit, I saw clearly that it must have been deposited by the person who found it. The bloody shirt and handkerchief confirmed the idea suggested by the bullet, for the blood upon examination proved to be capital claret, and no more. When I came to think of these things, and also of the late increase of liberality and expenditure on the part of Mr. Goodfellow, I entertained a suspicion which was none the less strong because I kept it altogether to myself. In the meantime, I instituted a rigorous private search for the corpse of Mr. Shuttleworthy, and, for good reasons, searched in quarters as divergent as possible from those to which Mr. Goodfellow conducted his party. The result was that, after some days, I came across an old, dry well, the mouth of which was nearly hidden by brambles, and here, at the bottom, I discovered what I sought. Now it so happened that I had overheard the colloquy between the two cronies, when Mr. Goodfellow had contrived to cajole his host into the promise of a box of Chateau Margaux. Upon this hint I acted. I procured a stiff piece of whalebone, thrust it down the throat of the corpse, and deposited the latter in an old wine box, taking care so to double the body up as to double the whalebone with it. In this manner, I had to press forcibly upon the lid to keep it down while I secured it with nails, and I anticipated, of course, that as soon as these latter were removed, the top would fly off, and the body up. Having thus arranged the box, I marked, numbered, and addressed it as already told, and then writing a letter in the name of the wine merchants with whom Mr. Shuttleworthy dealt, I gave instructions to my servant to wheel the box to Mr. Goodfellow's door, in a barrow, at a given signal from myself. For the words which I intended the corpse to speak, I confidently depended upon my ventriloquial abilities. For their effect, I counted upon the conscience of the murderous wretch. I believe there is nothing more to be explained. Mr. Pennyfeather was released upon the spot, inherited the fortune of his uncle, profited by the lessons of experience, turned over a new leaf, and led happily ever afterwards a new life. Whoa, okay. So, first, I thought it could have gone a different way that and could be fodder for another story at some point. I don't know. That it was a prank between the two, Goodfellow and Shuttleworthy, to um, stimulate the nephew to become a better person. But it was the whole time that part of the is it the untrustworthy narrator or unreliable narrator from that beginning. Um, and yeah, again. I say this every single time that I'm always surprised with Poe, even when I'm not surprised. Because and and again, going back to what I was saying about the sarcasm or reading it in the correct tone, like it is this whole first part. It seems it's like it's a dramatic recitation by this detective or whatever, and making it up to be, making that the man, thou art the man, up to be this good fellow, of which his name is. And you can tell that that's what it is, and that it's somewhat sarcastic, and yeah, and then at that, oh shoot, sorry, and then at that moment of this break here, can you see that? Sorry, this break here. It then goes into the more serious aspect of it. And then, of course, you have him shoving a whale bone down into a corpse and nailing it into a wine crate. Because why not? Why not? Ha ha ha. Yeah. And it's one of those things where you think about it like, oh yeah, good detective, but how messed up are you to just nonchalantly talk about this and do this in order to have it be? And I guess it might also, again, hindsight's 2020 sort of things. You can make these connections that might not have been intended, as he talked about in the last story. That he's a presentational sort of character, where in the beginning his story is presentational, dramatic, lifting up the guy and talking about him in such a way, and then he's setting up a corpse and his ventriloquial abilities, like he has a presentational nature. Anyway, and then and there's a happy ending. I mean, apart from the bloody corpse that again gets a whalebone shoved down. I do. I'm just okay. Picture this detective finding the corpse, all solemn, and then taking a whalebone and shoving it down the bloodied corpse, folding it into a wine crate, putting the lid on, like jumping on top of it to hold it down and nail it shut. It's just, the imagery is exquisite. Oh no, I don't. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh, I might be able to quick do this one. Okay. Because yes, I am gonna do this one because I did put it in the title. Pandemic. The Sphinx. Well, epidemic. So that was Thou Art the Man. This is the Sphinx. During the dread reign of the cholera in New York, I had accepted the invitation of a relative to spend a fortnight with it. Oh, by the way, in case anyone was wondering, I don't know if this is actually what it is. Hang on. And even if you aren't, and if you already know, and maybe it isn't even this, but it works. A fortnight, right? It's 2 weeks, or it's 14 nights. Oh, excellent. Sorry, I realized that recently, and it tickled me greatly. Anyway, the Sphinx. We're moving on because I have to. The Sphinx. During the dread reign of the cholera in New York, I had accepted the invitation of a relative to spend a fortnight with him in the retirement of his cottage ornée, his ornate cottage, his lovely cottage ornée, on the banks of the Hudson. We had here around us all the ordinary means of summer amusement, and what with rambling in the woods, sketching, boating, fishing, bathing, music, and books, we should have passed the time pleasantly enough, but for the fearful intelligence which reached us every morning from the populous city. Not a day elapsed which did not bring us news of the decease of some acquaintance. Ooh. Then, as the fatality increased, we learned to expect daily the loss of some friend. At length we trembled at the approach of every messenger. The very air from the south seemed to us redolent with death. That palsying thought, indeed, took entire possession of my soul. I could neither speak, think, nor dream of anything else. My host was of a less excitable temperament, and although greatly depressed in spirits, exerted himself to sustain my own. His richly philosophical intellect was not at any time affected by unrealities. To the substances of terror he was sufficiently alive, but of its shadows he had no apprehension. His endeavors to arouse me from the condition of abnormal gloom into which I had fallen were frustrated in great measure by certain volumes which I had found in his library. These were of a character to force into germination whatever seeds of hereditary superstition lay latent in my bosom. I had been reading these books without his knowledge, and thus he was often at a loss to account for the forcible impressions which had been made upon my fancy. A favorite topic with me was the popular belief in omens, a belief which, at this one epoch of my life, I was almost seriously disposed to defend. On this subject we had long and animated discussions, he maintaining the utter groundlessness of faith in such matters, I contending that a popular sentiment arising from absolute spontaneity, that is to say, without apparent traces of suggestion, had in itself the unmistakable elements of truth, and was entitled to much respect. The fact is that soon after my arrival at the cottage, there had occurred to myself an incident so entirely inexplicable, and which had in it so much of the portentous character, that I might well have been excused for regarding it as an omen. It appalled and at the same time so confounded and bewildered me that many days elapsed before I could make up my mind to communicate the circumstance to my friend. Near the close of an exceedingly warm day, I was sitting, book in hand, at an open window, commanding, through a long vista of the river banks, a view of a distant hill, the face of which nearest my position had been denuded by what is termed a landslide of the principal portion of its trees. My thoughts had been long wandering from the volume before me to the gloom and desolation of the neighboring city. Uplifting my eyes from the page, they fell upon the naked face of the hill, and upon an object, upon some living monster of hideous conformation, which very rapidly made its way from the summit to the bottom, disappearing finally in the dense forest below. As this creature first came in sight, I doubted my own sanity, or at least the evidence of my own eyes, and many minutes passed before I succeeded in convincing myself that I was neither mad nor in a dream. Yet when I described the monster, which I distinctly saw, and calmly surveyed through the whole period of its progress, my readers, I fear, will feel more difficulty in being convinced of these points than even I did myself. Estimating the size of the creature by comparison with the diameter of the large trees near which it passed, the few giants of the forest which had escaped the fury of the landslide, I concluded it to be far larger than any ship of the line in existence. Ooh, very big. I say ship of the line because the shape of the monster suggested the idea. The hull of one of our 74s might convey a very tolerable conception of the general outline. The mouth of the animal was situated at the extremity of a proboscis some 60 or 70 feet in length, and about as thick as the body of an ordinary elephant. Near the root of this trunk was an immense quantity of black, shaggy hair, more than could have been supplied by the coats of a score of buffaloes, and projecting from this hair downwardly and laterally, sprang two gleaming tusks, not unlike those of the wild boar, but of infinitely greater dimension. Extending forward, parallel with the proboscis, and on each side of it was a gigantic staff, 30 or 40 feet in length, formed seemingly of pure crystal and in shape a perfect prism. It reflected in the most gorgeous manner the rays of the declining sun. The trunk was fashioned like a wedge with the apex to the earth. From it there were outspread two pairs of wings, each wing nearly 100 yards in length, one pair being placed above the other, and all thickly covered with metal scales, each scale apparently some 10 or 12 feet in diameter. I observed that the upper and lower tiers of wings were connected by a strong chain, but the chief peculiarity of this horrible thing was the representation of a death's head, which covered nearly the whole surface of its breast, and which was as accurately traced in glaring white upon the dark ground of the body as if it had been there carefully designed by an artist. While I regarded this terrific animal, and more especially the appearance on its breast, with a feeling of horror and awe, with a sentiment of forthcoming evil which I found it impossible to quell by any effort of the reason, I perceived the huge jaws at the extremity of the proboscis suddenly expand themselves, and from them there proceeded a sound so loud and so expressive of woe that it struck upon my nerves like a knell. And as the monster disappeared at the foot of the hill, I fell at once, fainting, to the floor. Upon recovering, my first impulse, of course, was to inform my friend of what I had seen and heard, and I can scarcely explain what feeling of repugnance it was which, in the end, operated to prevent me. At length one evening, some 3 or 4 days after the occurrence, we were sitting together in the room in which I had seen the apparition, I occupying the same seat at the same window, and he lounging on a sofa near at hand. The association of the place and time impelled me to give him an account of the phenomenon. He heard me to the end, at first laughed heartily, and then lapsed into an excessively grave demeanor, as if my insanity was a thing beyond suspicion. At this instant I again had a distinct view of the monster, to which, with a shout of absolute terror, I now directed his attention. He looked eagerly, but maintained that he saw nothing, although I designated minutely the course of the creature as it made its way down the naked face of the hill. I was now immeasurably alarmed, for I considered the vision either as an omen of my death, or worse, as the forerunner of an attack of mania. I threw myself passionately back in my chair, and for some moments buried my face in my hands. When I uncovered my eyes, the apparition was no longer visible. My host, however, had in some degree resumed the calmness of his demeanor, and questioned me very rigorously in respect to the conformation of the visionary creature. When I had fully satisfied him on this head, he sighed deeply, as if relieved of some intolerable burden, and went on to talk, with what I thought a cruel calmness, of various points of speculative philosophy, which had heretofore formed subject of discussion between us. I remember his insisting very especially, among other things, upon the idea that the principal source of error in all human investigations lay in the liability of the understanding to underrate or to overvalue the importance of an object, through mere misadmeasurement of its propinquity. To estimate properly, for example, he said, hang on, I actually want to look at this. Propinquity, the state of being close to someone or something, proximity. Huh. To estimate properly, for example, he said, the influence to be exercised on mankind at large by the thorough diffusion of democracy, the distance of the epoch at which such diffusion may possibly be accomplished, should not fail to form an item in the estimate. Yet can you tell me one writer on the subject of government who has ever thought this particular branch of the subject worthy of discussion at all? He here paused for a moment, stepped to a bookcase, and brought forth one of the ordinary synopses of natural history. Requesting me then to change seats with him, that he might the better distinguish the fine print of the volume, he took my armchair at the window, and opening the book, resumed his discourse very much in the same tone as before. But for your exceeding minuteness, he said, in describing the monster, I might never have had it in my power to demonstrate to you what it was. In the first place, let me read to you a schoolboy account of the genus Sphinx, of the family Crepuscularia, of the order Lepidoptera, of the class of Insecta, or insects. The account runs thus. 4 membranous wings covered with little colored scales of a metallic appearance, mouth forming a rolled proboscis produced by an elongation of the jaws, upon the sides of which are found the rudiments of mandibles and downy palpi. The inferior wings retained to the superior by a stiff hair, autono in the form of an elongated club, prismatic, abdomen pointed. The death's-headed sphinx has occasioned much terror among the vulgar at times by the melancholy kind of cry which it utters, and the insignia of death which it wears upon its corslet. He here closed the book and leaned forward in the chair, placing himself accurately in the position which I had occupied at the moment of beholding the monster. Ah, here it is, he presently exclaimed. It is reascending the face of the hill, and a very remarkable-looking creature I admit it to be. Still, it is by no means so large or so distant as you imagined it. For the fact is that as it wriggles its way up this thread which some spider has wrought along the window sash, I find it to be about the 16th of an inch in its extreme length, and also about the 16th of an inch distant from the pupil of my eye. Oh my gosh, that was awesome. Isn't there like a death's-headed moth as well? That's so funny. I would love to look at a picture of that to see what exactly it was. But yeah, that was That was fun. It did. It seemed like it was going to be sort of a more uh, more serious one, but then it ended up being slightly more light for it. And there's a moral there too, to make sure you're looking at it in context and from the proper angle, and making sure it's not being blown out of proportion. So yes, that was an evening of Edgar Allan Poe, more short stories. That was The Sphinx, and da 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 da. And I had a great time. I hope you did too. Um, sorry. Hmm? To whoever got lost and found their way here or found their way back, thank you. I appreciate it having you here. And yeah, hope to see you again soon. It will be Thursday for more Buster Keaton. Well, actually, I'm thinking perhaps potentially, I have to figure out again my schedule. I do want to do the the flight simulator more, and I think I'm going to do that more earlier. So I'll probably do that like during the day, and then I'll be keeping to my schedule, but more randomly or sporadically whenever I get a chance to do the flight simulator. I'll just stream it, regardless of whether or not that later I will be doing one of the regular streams. That way I can do that as often as I can, as well as keep doing other games, which is what I want to do as well. I'm thinking perhaps potentially trying Call of Duty on Sunday just to see how that goes. If it goes well, I have Warzone if there is. I don't know. I have never played it myself before, so it'll be interesting and probably amusing, my pain of attempting it. Um, and my lack of knowledge. I'll have a lot of fun, but I won't know anything. So yes, I'm thinking of trying that. If Warzone has a single player arc or way to just do it single player, I will do that first, and then otherwise, I will do. I think it's Cold War, Black Ops Cold War. So yeah, so that will be Sunday. So whenever sporadically I'll be doing Flight Simulator whenever I get to that. On Thursday will be more Buster Keaton, same time, and Sunday will be attempted Call of Duty at the same time. Yeah. So, anyway, again, thank you. Appreciate having you here. Hope to see you again soon. And have a great whatever it is going to be for you. And yeah, thank you and bye.